The storm gathered over the ridge, thunder rolling like a verdict not yet spoken. Below, 3 McAllister men circled their prey, a woman broken, dispossessed, left in the dust. One raised a rope, the coarse hemp twisting in his fist like a claim of ownership. Another spat her name like a curse, as if she were less than flesh, less than breath. And then Elias Carter moved, silent, unyielding. He stepped into the storm as though he had been carved from the very rock of the valley. No words, no threats, only presence. His boots struck the dirt with the weight of something older and heavier than law. The rope slipped, the smirk faltered, and for a moment even the thunder seemed to wait. But the story didn't begin here. It began weeks earlier, under the same unrelenting sky, when Clara Whitfield lost the last of everything she could call her own. Her husband had been gone a year. Fever took him in 3 short days, leaving her a widow with no child, no heir, no voice in the matter of land. The McAllisters, his kin, wasted no time. They took the farm, the livestock, and the tools, claiming the law was on their side. And perhaps it was in those border territories where the law bent toward whoever had the most hands and the loudest voices. But it wasn't enough to strip her of land. They stripped her of dignity, too. On the day they turned her out, they forced her to stand beneath the pitiless sun with nothing but shame for clothing. Neighbors turned away. No one raised a hand to stop it. In the Wyoming Territory of 1871, a widow without kin was no more secure than a lone calf among wolves. That was the hour Elias Carter appeared. A tall man, shoulders squared by years of hard labor and scars left by the war between the states. He had fought at Shiloh, carried the weight of men dying in mud and fire, and come west when peace brought him no peace. Folks in town said he had chosen solitude for good. But on that day his silence broke, not in words, but in action. He dismounted, slow and deliberate. From behind his saddle he pulled a woolen blanket, coarse and weather-stained, and without a word wrapped it around Clara's trembling frame. His hands never lingered, never pressed, only steadied, like a carpenter fitting timber into place. A gesture of dignity where none had been left. Then he turned to the McAllisters, his gaze steady, his voice quiet as a church bell at dusk. "Get off my land." It was not a threat, it was a command, as immovable as stone. And so the journey began, one broken woman, one silent man, riding into the wide, merciless land where storms gathered and the horizon promised either ruin or redemption. The road away from the McAllisters' land was a scar through the dust, and Elias guided his horse along it without looking back. Clara sat in front of him, wrapped in the rough blanket, her body rigid with the kind of exhaustion that comes only after humiliation. She did not speak, and he did not ask her to. The land itself seemed to carry their silence, the rhythm of hooves a steady drumbeat beneath the vast, indifferent sky. The air was thick with sage and dust, the smell of a storm far away, as though even the weather knew to keep its distance. Elias had lived alone in that valley for 5 years, working soil that gave little, mending fences that broke often, and carrying a past he never laid down. His ranch was a modest thing, born not of wealth but of sweat and stubbornness. A barn that leaned against the wind, a cabin with a stone hearth, a few cattle that kept him honest. It was not much, but it was his. He had not expected to share it with another soul, much less a woman cast aside with nothing. Yet as the miles passed, he did not feel the burden grow heavier. Instead, there was a strange certainty, as though Providence itself had laid this path before him. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, refusing to turn her head toward the man whose presence had altered the course of her fate. She was not ready to trust, not ready to believe. Her body still trembled in small, unbidden waves, though she forced her face to remain composed. Pride was all that remained to her, and she would not let it go. She thought of her husband, kind but weak, and how quickly his kin had stripped her bare of every promise he had once made. Loss had become her shadow, and now it followed her onto the back of this stranger's horse. When at last the valley opened before them, Clara caught her first glimpse of Elias's homestead. It was no grand estate, but it stood with a kind of quiet defiance against the wilderness. The cabin's timbers had darkened under years of wind and sun. The fences traced long lines into the hills, and the barn sat squat and sturdy like a soldier holding ground. Smoke from the hearth curled faintly into the sky, carrying the smell of wood and ash. It was not beauty in the way she had once known, but it was strength. And for the first time since the McAllisters had cast her out, she felt something other than despair. She felt the faint, almost imperceptible stirrings of safety. Elias dismounted first, then reached up without hesitation to lift her down. His hands were calloused but steady, circling her waist for the briefest moment until her feet found the earth. She staggered, her legs unwilling to remember their duty, and he steadied her until she could stand on her own. He said nothing, offered no comfort beyond the firmness of his grip. Then, without waiting for thanks, he led the horse toward the trough. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled faintly of leather, coffee, and old wood smoke. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, swept clean, ready for flame. The furniture was plain, handmade, softened by years of use. Elias pointed toward a closed door. "That room is yours," he said simply. "There are clothes on the bed, my mother's." His voice carried no pity, no explanation, just fact, offered like water in the desert. Then he turned toward the stove, striking a flame that caught in the kindling and bloomed into light. The crackle filled the silence, and for the first time since the dust and cruelty of that morning, Clara allowed herself to breathe. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Clara moved through the cabin like a shadow, her bare feet barely whispering against the plank floors. Days passed in silence, broken only by the distant hammer of Elias mending fence posts, or the lowing of cattle in the pasture. She drifted from wall to wall, her fingers grazing the rough grain of timber, the seams in the handmade furniture. Everything here bore the mark of use. No ornament, no luxury, only purpose. Even the air smelled of effort, wood smoke, leather, and the faint bitterness of coffee grounds left too long on the stove. Her meals were left without ceremony. A piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, a bowl of beans cooling on the table by mid-afternoon, and always a tin cup of water drawn from the well. Elias said nothing when he came or went. His heavy boots rose and fell with the same rhythm as the land itself. At first, she resented the quiet. Silence had been her punishment with the McAllisters, their refusal to acknowledge her as anything more than a burden. But slowly, this silence began to take on a different weight. It was not dismissal, it was space. One morning, with the sun just breaking across the valley, she found herself standing before a small wooden box tucked in the corner of her room. Inside were relics of a life she could not imagine belonging to Elias. A faded photograph of a stern-faced woman whose eyes mirrored his. A set of whittled birds, rough but tender in their shape. And, wrapped in a square of cloth, a porcelain teacup with its handle broken away. She turned it carefully in her hands. The glaze was cracked, the rim chipped, but it had been kept, protected, as if its brokenness had meaning. Clara pressed her thumb along the fracture line and felt something stir in her chest. She, too, was fractured, carried to this place with sharp edges of shame and grief. Yet here was proof that something broken could still be worth keeping. When she set the cup back down, she realized her breath was steady for the first time in weeks. She lingered by the hearth, watching the pale light crawl across the floorboards. The cabin, bare though it was, began to feel less like a prison and more like a waiting place, a pause in a song before the melody returned. Elias came in near dusk, shoulders dark with sweat and dust, his hat pulled low against the sun. He did not look at her directly, only nodded once before setting down a coil of rope by the door. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls, placed one at the table's edge for her, and ate his own without pause. Clara hesitated, then sat opposite him. They ate in silence, the scrape of spoons and the soft hiss of fire the only conversation. Yet when her eyes lifted, just for a heartbeat, she caught him glance at her across the rim of his bowl. It was not possession, nor pity. It was recognition. That night, alone in her narrow bed, Clara thought not of what she had lost, but of the teacup in the wooden box. A vessel cracked and mended, still able to hold something within. She pulled the blanket close, and for the first time since the McAllisters had cast her out, she let her eyes close without fear of what dawn might bring. The days settled into rhythm, measured not by clocks but by the sun's arc and the call of chores. Clara kept mostly inside, moving from hearth to window, tracing patterns in the wood with her fingertips. Yet the air within the cabin grew close, heavy as a sealed trunk. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness she could neither name nor resist, she pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch. The light struck her sharply, filling her eyes with brilliance after so many days of shadows. The air was different out here, crisp and wide, touched with the scent of sage and dust. The wind lifted strands of her hair, carrying them across her face as though reminding her she was still part of the living world. She clutched the edge of the blanket around her shoulders, suddenly uncertain, as if she were trespassing in a place she did not deserve to be. Out in the distance, Elias was repairing a section of fence. He moved with the steady cadence of a man who had repeated the same work 1,000 times: raise the post, align, hammer, step back, hammer again. His body spoke the language of labor, patient, relentless, without flourish. Clara's eyes fixed on him, hesitant, as though caught in a moment not meant for her. He did not turn, not once. But his rhythm shifted, just for a breath, the hammer slowing in its descent, pausing at the top of its arc before driving down again. It was enough to tell her he knew she was there, watching. And yet he offered no acknowledgment beyond that hesitation, no wave, no call, no glance. He allowed her the dignity of the moment, as though to say, "You are free to stand in the sunlight if you choose. No one will take that from you here." Clara drew in a long breath. The valley stretched before her, endless in its silence, dotted with sagebrush and the distant shimmer of heat. Somewhere a meadowlark sang, its notes cutting sharp and clean through the stillness. For the first time since her exile, she felt a flicker of choice, fragile, unsteady, but real. She could step back inside, return to the shadows. Or she could remain here, in the light, and claim the air as her own. She chose to stay. The minutes passed quietly. She listened to the thud of the hammer, the answering echo from the post, the faint clink of metal against wood. Each sound carried weight, grounding her to a present that was no longer defined by the McAllisters' cruelty. The porch boards beneath her feet, the wind against her cheek, the warmth of the sun, these things belonged to her now. When Elias finally shouldered his tools and began walking back toward the barn, Clara retreated inside before he could see her. But she carried the sunlight with her, a brightness stitched into the fabric of her chest. That evening, when he set down another plate of beans and cornbread, she met his eyes briefly before lowering her gaze. He said nothing, just nodded once, but in that silence lay an understanding. It was not yet trust, but it was the first step toward it. The storm came without mercy. Winds barreled down the valley like a freight of unseen beasts, rattling the shutters and moaning against the corners of the cabin. Clara woke to the sound of cattle lowing in panic, their cries jagged against the howl of the gale. When she rose from bed, Elias was already at the door, pulling on his boots, lantern swinging from one hand. She should have stayed inside, she told herself. This was not her world. But something stronger than fear tugged her forward. She snatched her shawl, pushed through the door, and followed him into the storm. Rain lashed sideways, cold needles against her skin. The lantern's flame guttered, straining against the wind, but Elias shielded it with his broad hand as they crossed the yard toward the barn. Lightning split the sky, throwing the valley into stark relief. Fences bending, trees whipping, the barn door shuddering on its hinges. Then came the sound, high, strained, desperate. A ewe in the birthing pen, her body heaving, the lamb caught crosswise and unable to come. Elias dropped to his knees in the straw, his hands already steady on the animal. His voice, low and calm, wove through the storm like a tether. "Hold the light," he said, tilting his head toward the lantern. Clara crouched beside him, gripping the glass chimney with both hands, angling it as he worked. The flame flickered, threatening to die, but she held firm. Her hair whipped across her face, soaked and heavy, yet her grip did not falter. For the first time since she had been cast out, she felt useful, necessary. Minutes stretched into an eternity of struggle. Elias coaxed, adjusted, worked with a focus born of years and patience. The ewe groaned, legs trembling. Clara's heart hammered as if the outcome were her own. Then, at last, with one final effort, the lamb slipped free into Elias's hands. For a terrible moment it lay still. Elias rubbed the small body with a scrap of burlap, brisk and relentless, clearing the airway, urging life into fragile lungs. Clara knelt frozen, her knuckles white on the lantern handle. Then came a shudder, a gasp, and a thin cry, weak but alive. The sound cut through the storm like music. Relief struck her so hard she nearly wept. She blinked against the rain and straw clinging to her face, watching as Elias nestled the lamb beside its trembling mother. His hands, so large and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness, guiding the newborn toward warmth. He sat back on his heels, chest rising and falling, his face streaked with water and sweat. His eyes closed for a breath, and in the hush between thunderclaps, Clara heard him murmur, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, His love endures forever." The words, simple and unadorned, struck deeper than any sermon. They were not meant for her ears, she knew. They rose from habit, from conviction carried quietly through years of solitude. But they reached her nonetheless, warming some hidden place long numbed by shame. When they returned to the cabin, dripping and shivering, the storm still raged outside, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of those who had faced the dark together and come away with something fragile and alive. The storm passed, leaving the valley washed clean. For days afterward, the air smelled of wet earth and sage, and the creek sang louder than before. Something inside Clara shifted with that night. The lamb's cry still echoed in her ears, a fragile sound that had proven life could return where death had hovered closest. She found herself restless within the cabin, her hands longing for work. One morning, she noticed Elias's shirt folded over the chair by the hearth, a sleeve ripped wide from fencework. She stared at it for a long time before searching through a small wooden chest. Among scraps of cloth and a spool of coarse thread, she found a needle. Her fingers were stiff at first, unpracticed, but muscle memory guided her. Each stitch she pulled was a quiet defiance against helplessness. When Elias came in at dusk, weary from the fields, the shirt lay neatly mended on the chair. He said nothing, but the next morning he wore it without remark. Clara caught sight of the new seam across his arm as he passed through the doorway, and a strange pride welled in her chest. Soon her hands sought other tasks. She began sweeping the floor each morning until the planks shone with pale light. She carried water from the well, scrubbed the tin plates until their dull surfaces gleamed. In the small patch of dirt behind the cabin, she found weeds choking the earth. She knelt in the soil, tugging them free, one by one. The work was slow, but the rhythm steadied her heart. When she uncovered a spring of mint growing wild by the fence line, she tended it carefully, as if guarding a secret. The first afternoon, she left a glass of cool mint water on the porch rail. Elias stopped short. His eyes lingered on the glass, then shifted to her where she sat on the steps, her hands folded in her lap. Without a word, he lifted it, drank, and set the empty glass down with a small nod. No thanks spoken, but none was needed. In turn, Elias began to respond in ways that were as spare as they were tender.
One morning she found a wildflower resting on the table, a burst of purple against the plain wood. Another evening, as they stood outside at twilight, he pointed toward the sky where a hawk circled high above the ridge. His finger traced its arc silently, as though sharing a piece of himself without demand or explanation. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer hollow. It carried weight, like soil ready to take root. Their days fell into a rhythm of quiet partnership. She cooked beans with bits of bacon when she found them in the cupboard, learned to stretch flour into bread. He repaired the roof before the next storm, pausing only to glance down where she knelt among her seedlings. Each act was small, almost unremarkable, but together they stitched a fabric stronger than words. And though Clara rarely lifted her eyes to meet his, she felt the threads tightening, binding them, not as prisoner and rescuer, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two souls slowly remembering what it meant to live alongside another. The evening settled with a quiet heaviness. Outside, the sky carried the bruised purple of a coming storm, though no rain had yet fallen. Clara sat by the hearth, mending a tear in her dress, the needle flashing in and out of cloth. Elias was near the stove, sharpening a knife with steady strokes, the rasp of stone against metal filling the silence. The room seemed weighted with something unspoken, thick as smoke before a fire catches. Clara set the fabric down. Her hands trembled, though not from the chill. She stared into the flames, watching them dance across the logs, and felt the words pressing against her chest. For weeks she had carried them like stones in her belly, heavy and grinding. Tonight she could no longer bear the weight.
"My husband," she began softly, the syllables tasting strange after so much silence. "He was a kind man, gentle, but he was not strong." Her voice wavered, and she drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "When fever took him, I thought grief would be my hardest trial. I was wrong." Elias did not move, but the sharpening stone slowed. Clara's gaze stayed on the fire, the words spilling now, each one scraping her raw. "His kin, the McAllisters, they never wanted me. To them, I was a wasted dowry, another mouth to feed. When he died, I became little more than a debt unpaid. They took the farm, the animals, even the dishes from the cupboard. And when there was nothing left to strip, they took my clothes too, cast me out with shame as if I were dirt beneath their boots." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself on. "They wanted to remind me, remind the whole town, that I was nothing, that without a husband, without land, a woman has no claim, not to dignity, not even to the ground beneath her feet." The room fell still. Elias's hand clenched around the knife handle, his jaw set hard, a muscle twitching at the corner. He placed the blade down slowly, deliberately, as though restraining a storm within. His eyes remained on the fire, not daring to meet hers, for fear that his anger might frighten her more than her confession already had. Clara's breath came shallow. For a moment she regretted speaking, feared the silence that followed would swallow her whole. But then she realized something. He had not interrupted, not once. He had not tried to soothe her with hollow words or rush her grief aside. He had borne it, steady as stone, letting her pain find air at last. When her voice broke, she pressed her hands to her face. The fire crackled, filling the space where her strength had failed. Then Elias spoke, his voice low, rough with something she could not name. "They wronged you." Just 3 words, but they carried the weight of judgment, heavy as an oath. Clara lowered her hands, blinking at the flames. The truth had been spoken, not dismissed or ignored, but witnessed. For the first time since her exile, her suffering felt less like a secret wound and more like a scar that might one day heal. The storm outside grumbled faintly across the ridge. Inside, another kind of storm had passed, leaving a silence that was no longer suffocating but shared. The days that followed carried a deceptive calm. Clara found herself moving more freely around the homestead, her steps no longer confined to the cabin. She worked in the small garden, pulling weeds, pressing seedlings into the soil. The rhythm steadied her, the smell of damp earth grounding her in a way she had not felt in years. The valley seemed a sanctuary, its wide embrace holding back the memory of all she had endured. But sanctuaries do not last forever. One afternoon, as the sun climbed toward its highest point, Clara paused from her work and shaded her eyes against the glare. Beyond the pasture, far up on the eastern ridge, a figure sat astride a horse. The distance was too great to see details, but every fiber in her knew who it was. The set of the shoulders, the way the horse shifted, but the rider did not. A McAllister. Her breath caught. The world narrowed to that single dark speck against the horizon. He did not move closer, did not call out, but remained there, watching. Long enough to make it clear he wanted her to see.
A chill slid down her spine despite the heat of the day. The safety she had begun to weave unraveled strand by strand. The valley, once a shield, now felt like a cage with walls too thin to keep the wolves at bay. She abandoned her tools and retreated into the cabin, bolting the door, though she knew it would not stop a determined hand. For hours she lingered by the window, waiting for the figure to vanish. At last, the rider turned and disappeared back over the ridge, but the dread remained, lodged like a thorn deep beneath her skin. That evening, Elias returned later than usual, his face shadowed by dust and the long hours of work. Clara said nothing of what she had seen. The words clung to her throat like burrs. But Elias seemed to know, as if the air itself had carried the warning to him. After supper, he spread a cloth across the table and laid his rifle upon it. The lantern hissed softly, casting his features into stark lines as he began to disassemble the weapon. Each motion was methodical, almost reverent. The pull of the pin, the scrape of oiled cloth against steel, the quiet click of pieces fitting into place.
His large hands, scarred and sure, moved with the ease of long practice. Clara sat by the hearth, her sewing forgotten in her lap, eyes fixed on him. He never spoke of the rider on the ridge, never asked if she had seen. Yet his silence was its own conversation. Each stroke of the cloth across the barrel was an acknowledgment. Yes, I know. Yes, they are coming. Yes, I will be ready. The cabin filled with the soft rhythm with preparation, metal singing low beneath his touch. Clara felt both terror and a strange, piercing comfort. He was not sharpening words, not raising threats, but readying himself in the only way he knew. The world beyond their quiet valley had not forgotten her, but neither had Elias. When he finished, he reassembled the rifle with calm precision and set it aside within reach. Then he leaned back, folding his hands loosely, eyes steady in the lantern glow. For the first time since the afternoon on the ridge, Clara's heartbeat eased. Not because the danger had lessened, but because it had been seen, named without a word, and prepared for. The silence between them deepened again. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of a vow waiting to be tested.
If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The valley lay unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that comes before the sky breaks open. Clara stood at the small window of the cabin, her hands pressed flat to the sill. The horizon shimmered under the weight of the sun, yet her eyes kept drifting back to the eastern ridge. She half expected to see it again, the dark figure she had glimpsed days ago. Even when nothing stirred, her chest carried the memory of that lone rider like a bruise that refused to fade. Elias had said nothing when she confessed her fear. He hadn't needed to. That evening, after the chores were done, he spread a square of oilcloth across the table and laid his rifle upon it. Clara watched from the hearth, the firelight catching the planes of his face as he worked. He moved with the calm precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Each piece came apart in his hands, pin, bolt, barrel, until the weapon was nothing but fragments gleaming on the table. Then he began to clean them, slow and deliberate. The cloth hissed against the steel, the scrape and click carrying through the quiet room. Clara sat very still, her sewing resting forgotten in her lap. She should have been comforted by the sight of him preparing, yet her heart twisted with a fear she couldn't name. His silence was not avoidance, it was acknowledgement. Every stroke of the cloth told her what he already knew. The McAllisters had not finished with her. They would come again. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind began to shift, stirring the trees in uneasy whispers. Elias lifted each piece of the rifle to the light, checking, testing, before setting it aside in perfect order. Clara studied his hands, broad and scarred, steady as stone. She realized with a sudden pang that this was not just a man of soil and cattle. This was a soldier, tempered by battles far from this valley, carrying discipline into every motion. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask him if they would survive what was coming, but the words stuck, heavy and useless. Instead, she folded her sewing, her fingers clumsy, and placed it aside. For a long moment she simply listened. The scrape of steel, the whisper of cloth, the faint moan of the wind outside. At last, Elias reassembled the rifle. Piece by piece, it became whole again until it lay across the table like a sleeping beast. He did not load it, nor sling it across his shoulder. He simply rested his palm on the barrel, eyes steady, as though drawing some quiet strength from its weight. The lantern flickered, shadows bending across the walls. Clara drew her blanket closer, her gaze fixed on the rifle and the man who had tended it with such care. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it lay something unexpected, a thread of assurance, fragile yet real. Whatever storm was gathering beyond the ridge, Elias would not yield. And when the time came, neither could she. The first low roll of thunder came in the late afternoon, crawling across the sky like a warning. Clara paused at the garden fence, her hands clutching the trowel, eyes lifting toward the ridge. The horizon had darkened, clouds swelling heavy and purple, their bellies shot through with streaks of light. And there, against the bruised sky, 3 riders emerged. They moved slowly, deliberately, silhouettes sharpened by the glow of lightning. Even at this distance, Clara recognized the posture, the arrogance that carried across the valley. McAllisters. Her breath caught in her throat, and the trowel slipped from her fingers into the dirt. It was not the first time she had seen them, but never had they come so near, never so plainly. This was no idle watching from afar. This was approach, intent written in the very lines of their bodies. The horses picked their way along the ridge, then stopped, standing as still as sentinels. Clara felt the weight of their gaze across the valley. She could not see their eyes, but she knew they looked down on her as they always had. Not as a woman, but as a possession, an object to be reclaimed. Shame, sharp and hot, surged through her chest. In an instant, she was back in that moment, their hands tearing away her last defenses, their laughter loud and cruel while she stood stripped and powerless under the burning sun. Her knees weakened. She caught the fence rail for balance, fingers digging into the wood. The wind rose, snapping her hair into her face, but she could not tear her eyes from the ridge. A storm gathered above and within her, its pressure suffocating. Elias's voice broke the spell. Inside, she startled. He stood a few paces behind, broad shoulders blocking the sight of the riders. His face was unreadable, carved in lines of iron, but his eyes fixed on the ridge with unflinching calm. Clara hesitated, her body torn between the instinct to flee and the shame of leaving him alone. But his voice came again, low, absolute. Inside. This time it carried not command, but something steadier, an assurance that he would bear what she could not. She turned and walked quickly to the cabin, every step like wading through mire. Her hands shook as she closed the door behind her, leaving it ajar just enough for her to peer through the crack. From the shadows of the cabin, she watched him. Elias stood motionless in the yard, the rising wind tugging at his coat, his hat brim casting his eyes into shadow. Thunder cracked overhead, louder now, rattling the glass panes. The three figures remained on the ridge, waiting. Lightning flared, illuminating them in stark brilliance. Clara pressed her forehead against the wood, her breath shallow, her heart pounding as if it would split her chest. Outside, the storm drew closer. Inside, silence pressed heavy. And Clara knew this was the beginning. The sound reached her before the sight did, the pounding of hooves, muffled by the thickening air yet steady, relentless. Clara pressed herself against the window frame, eyes fixed on the eastern ridge. The riders were no longer silhouettes. They had descended, three figures cutting across the valley floor, dust rising beneath their horses even as the first drops of rain speckled the dirt. Her breath came shallow. She backed away from the window, the memory of their voices tightening around her like a noose. She wanted to hide, to shrink into the walls, but the compulsion to see was stronger. Through the narrow crack of the door, she watched as the McAllisters entered the yard. The horses slowed, circling as if the ranch itself were already theirs. The eldest, the patriarch, pulled his mount to a halt in front of the porch. His face was sharp as stone, his mouth curled in the same contempt Clara remembered too well. His sons flanked him, brutish shadows with rope coiled at their belts. The old man's voice rose, thin and cutting against the wind. "We've come for what's ours." His hand swept the yard as if claiming the soil beneath their hooves. "Send her out." Clara's body stiffened. Her fingers clutched the edge of the door until the wood bit into her skin. Shame threatened to choke her again, dragging her back to that sun-bleached humiliation. She pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to weep, to crumble. Then Elias stepped out onto the porch. He did not carry his rifle. He carried nothing but himself. His boots struck the boards with quiet certainty, his frame filling the space between the McAllisters and the cabin. The storm winds caught the brim of his hat, rain tracing lines down his coat, but his stance was immovable, as though he were part of the porch itself. "She's not yours," he said, voice low but unyielding. The younger son sneered, swinging from his saddle, boots hitting the ground with a thud. "By law she is. By right she is. You think a stray widow belongs to you?" He spat into the dirt, coiling the rope in his hand. Elias's eyes did not waver. His silence stretched until even the horses shifted uneasily, as though sensing the tension. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She pressed closer to the crack in the door, terror and something sharper mingling in her veins.
The old man leaned forward in his saddle, his voice rising. "This isn't your fight, Carter. Step aside." But Elias did not step aside. He did not move at all. Thunder rumbled low across the valley, echoing the storm gathering above and within. The yard was silent, save for the restless shifting of hooves and the low moan of the rising wind. Rain began to spatter the dust, each drop a dark mark spreading outward, as if the earth itself braced for what was coming. The elder McAllister straightened in his saddle, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Step aside, Carter. You've no claim on her. She belongs with her husband's kin, as the law declares." His voice was sharp, triumphant, as though the storm itself might bend to his will. Elias's face was a mask of stone. "She's not yours." His words cut through the storm like an iron bell. The younger son laughed, the sound coarse, empty of mirth. He slapped the rope against his leg, the fibers frayed from use. "We mean to have her back, by rope or by hand, it makes no difference." He took a step forward, boots sinking into the damp earth. From the crack in the door, Clara's whole body shook. Her knuckles were white against the wood, her lungs clawing for air. The memory of rough hands, of mocking eyes, pressed against her chest. Fear threatened to swallow her whole, to drag her back into the pit they had cast her into once before.
But in the pounding of her heart, another sound rose, a remembered cadence, a verse once whispered in childhood, now returning like a lifeline. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. Isaiah 43:2. The words steadied her trembling, not by removing the fear, but by giving it shape, by reminding her that even here, on this porch, in this storm, she was not abandoned. Elias remained still, but the air around him carried a weight that no weapon could match. The elder McAllister's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. The storm pressed harder, thunder cracking above, wind tugging at coats and hats, making the horses toss their heads. The second son shouted over the gale, "Move aside, or you'll be buried with her." His hand twitched near his belt, the threat of steel barely veiled. Elias did not reach for a weapon. His arms hung loose at his sides, his shoulders squared, his presence unshaken. "She stays." The words were soft, almost drowned by the thunder, but their finality cut through the storm like lightning. For the first time, the McAllisters faltered. The rope in the younger son's hand stilled, dangling useless at his side. Inside the cabin, Clara pressed her forehead to the wood, tears blurring her vision. Not of despair, but of something else, something fierce and unfamiliar. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of another standing between her and the darkness, not as a wall that confined her, but as a shield that held. The storm was gathering, inside and out, and there would be no turning back. The younger McAllister spat into the mud and tightened his grip on the rope. His grin split wide, cruel, the same grin Clara remembered the day they stripped her of everything. He started forward, boots sinking into the wet soil, rope swinging at his side. Elias did not move from the porch. His eyes tracked the man's approach, calm as a winter lake, his body loose but coiled like a bowstring. "Last chance, Carter," the elder McAllister barked over the rising wind. "Stand down.
She belongs with us." The son lunged up the steps, rope raised as if to snare a wild animal. Elias moved. It was not a swing, not a strike of rage, but a clean, brutal motion born of discipline. He met the man halfway, his body crashing forward with the force of stone breaking free from a cliff. The younger McAllister hit the ground hard, the rope torn from his hand, his breath ripped from his chest. Mud splashed upward, rain hammering down in sheets. The elder swore, jerking at his reins. The second son reached for his belt, but froze as Elias straightened on the porch. His shoulders rose with each breath, his eyes blazing cold fire. There was no gloating in his stance, no need to taunt, only a certainty that filled the yard heavier than the thunder above. Lightning split the sky, a jagged spear casting them all in stark brilliance. The horses reared, panicked by the storm's fury. The wind howled through the valley, tearing at coats, flinging rain sideways like shards of glass. "Leave," Elias said, his voice carrying steady through the roar, "and do not return." It was not shouted, it did not need to be. The words held the weight of prophecy, final and irrevocable. Clara's heart thundered with the storm. Through the crack of the door she watched the McAllisters falter, the elder clenching his jaw, the second son's hand frozen inches from his weapon, the youngest writhing in the mud, struggling for breath. For the first time, she saw fear on their faces. Another clap of thunder cracked above, louder than before, shaking the very boards beneath her feet. Rain poured down in torrents, the yard turning to mire in seconds. The storm had broken, wild and unrelenting, as if heaven itself had risen to bear witness. The McAllisters gathered themselves, anger sputtering against fear. They hauled the fallen son to his feet, curses lost to the gale. With one final glare, the elder jerked his reins, turning his horse toward the ridge. The others followed, retreating into the storm, their shouts swallowed by thunder and rain. Elias stood alone on the porch, rain streaming from his hat,
unmoving until the last trace of them vanished into the curtain of weather. Inside, Clara's tears fell freely now, not of terror, but of release. For the first time since her world had been taken, the chains around her chest loosened. The storm had broken. And with it, so had the hold of the McAllisters. The storm raged on long after the McAllisters had disappeared into its folds. Rain poured in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof, pounding the earth into rivers of mud. The sky roared with thunder, flashes of lightning searing the valley in brief, violent bursts of white. Yet for all its fury, the storm no longer carried the taste of dread. It carried cleansing. Clara stood by the door, her forehead pressed to the wood, listening to the echoes of hooves fade into nothing. Her body shook, but not from fear. The trembling came from release, from the sudden absence of a weight she had carried so long it had become a second skin. She opened her eyes, staring at the rain streaming down the porch steps, each drop washing away the dust of her shame, the stain of the McAllisters' cruelty. Elias had not moved since they left. He remained on the porch, rain cascading from his coat, pooling around his boots. He stood like a sentinel carved from the land itself, his presence as steady as the mountains bracing the horizon. At last, when the last echo of thunder rolled into silence, he exhaled, a sound more like a sigh than a word. Clara stepped forward, the floor creaking softly under her weight. She pushed the door wide and crossed the threshold, the rain immediately soaking her shift, clinging cold against her skin. But she did not retreat. She stood beside him on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, her breath mingling with his in the damp night air. Neither spoke. There was no need. The storm had spoken for them, roaring its judgment, delivering its verdict. Clara lifted her gaze to the sky. Dark clouds tore apart, revealing a sliver of pale moonlight. The valley shimmered wet and bright, cleansed by the downpour. She thought of the verse that had steadied her heart moments before. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. She had walked through, they both had, and they still stood. Her hand trembled at her side, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar, something that startled her with its strength, hope. The air smelled of sage, sharp and new, and the earth beneath them felt firmer than it had in years. Elias glanced at her, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His eyes held no triumph, no boast, only the quiet certainty of a man who had done what needed to be done.
Clara met his gaze for the briefest moment, and in it she saw not just the man who had stood for her, but the man who might stand with her. Lightning no longer split the sky. The storm was passing, leaving behind a valley reborn, washed clean. Clara breathed deep, her shoulders easing, her chest lifting for the first time without the old burden pressing down. For years she had been defined by loss, by cruelty, by shame. Tonight, the storm had stripped that away, leaving only what remained when the darkness fled: resilience, faith, and the quiet strength of a man who chose to stand when others would not. They stood together in silence, watching the last of the storm retreat into the distance. It was not the end of their story, but it was the end of fear. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The storm broke the valley wide open, and when morning came, the land looked changed. The air was sharp and new, washed clean of dust. Pools of water shimmered in the hollows, the earth dark and rich again beneath the pale sweep of dawn. For the first time since Clara had crossed Elias's threshold, the ranch felt less like a shelter borrowed against cruelty and more like the beginning of something her own. She rose early, drawn by a restlessness that had nothing to do with fear. The garden patch behind the cabin glistened with droplets, the soil soft beneath her hands. She knelt and pressed seedlings into the wet ground, her fingers steady, her breath even. Each sprout felt like a promise, fragile but alive. Inside, Elias worked in silence, patching the roof where shingles had blown loose, his boots sounding against the boards above her head.
His movements carried the same economy of effort she had seen since her first day here, but something subtle had shifted. He no longer worked as if he were alone. He left tools leaned neatly against the wall where she could reach them, a gesture that spoke louder than words. By evening, the rhythm of their days had settled into a quiet partnership. She cooked with what little they had, stretching beans and bread with herbs she coaxed from the garden. He mended the barn, pausing now and then to point out the hawks circling above the ridge or the fresh tracks of a deer that had passed near the fence line. They rarely spoke, but the silence no longer weighed heavy. It was a language of its own, built from nods, glances, the scrape of a chair drawn to the table, the soft thud of boots by the door. It was in that silence that Clara found the broken teacup again. She had left it tucked away in the small wooden box after the day she first discovered it, unwilling then to claim its fragile comfort. Now, as she held the pieces in her lap, she saw it differently. The cracks were still there, sharp and plain, but instead of ruin, they told a story of endurance. Slowly, with patient care, she began piecing it back together. She used what little paste she could find, her fingers trembling as she fitted rim to rim, shard to shard. Some seams would never disappear. The cup would never be whole in the way it once was. But it would stand again, and it could hold. As she worked, she felt a strange kinship with the object, as though its brokenness and hers were threads woven of the same cloth.
When Elias returned from the barn that evening, he paused at the doorway, his eyes falling to where she sat by the hearth. She did not explain, did not lift her gaze. She simply continued her task, hands careful, movements deliberate. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he crossed the room, set down the coil of rope in his hands, and sat at the table in silence, watching the fire burn low. Days passed, and Clara tended the cup as faithfully as she tended the garden. At last, one morning, she set it on the windowsill, its surface traced with fine dark seams. She filled it with the small purple flowers that grew wild along the creek bed. Sunlight caught on the glaze, broken but shining. Elias stopped when he saw it, his shadow falling across the sill. He reached out with one finger, rough and calloused, and brushed the edge of a petal. For the first time, Clara saw his mouth soften, the stern lines easing into something rare, something gentle, a smile, slow and unpracticed, yet unmistakable. The house no longer felt like his alone. In that moment, it became theirs. Spring settled softly over the valley, wrapping the land in tender green.
The storm of that night lingered only in memory, its fury now a distant echo beneath skies bright and clear. Fields glistened with new shoots, the creek sang with melted snow, and wildflowers traced purple and gold across the foothills. Each day, Clara woke with purpose. She gathered eggs from the hens, kneaded bread with careful hands, tended mint and herbs in the garden. The cabin, once a place she drifted through like a ghost, now pulsed with the rhythm of shared life. Elias, too, had shifted. He worked the fences and cattle with the same endurance as before, but in the evenings he returned to a table where food waited, to a hearth that warmed more than his bones. He no longer ate in silence, bent over his bowl. He lingered, sometimes even pointing out a bird's call or a story etched into a scar on his forearm. Small words, small gestures, but they marked the breaking of years of solitude. It was not a grand transformation, not sudden, but steady as roots pushing into soil. They were two people who had known loss, whose lives had cracked under the weight of cruelty and war. Yet day by day, they found strength in the quiet presence of each other. One morning, the air held the freshness of new rain, the sky painted with the first blush of dawn. Clara stepped onto the porch, a shawl wrapped over her shoulders. Elias was already there, leaning against the railing, eyes fixed on the ridge where once the McAllisters had appeared like shadows of doom. Now the ridge glowed golden under the rising sun. For a long moment they stood in silence, the light spilling over them, gilding the valley below. Clara's breath caught at the beauty of it, how the land, once scarred by fear, now stretched open and whole. She thought of all she had endured, the stripping of dignity, the weight of shame, the long silence of survival. And yet here she stood, alive, with the dawn warming her face and the steady presence of a man who had chosen to shield her, not possess her. Her hand brushed against the railing, close to his. She did not take his hand, not yet, but the nearness itself was enough. She glanced sideways. Elias turned to meet her gaze, his expression unreadable at first. Then the corners of his mouth lifted, subtle, unpracticed, but real. A smile not of victory, but of peace. Clara felt her throat tighten, not with grief this time, but with gratitude. The verse she had once heard in a quiet church service rose unbidden to her lips, as if carried by the dawn itself. "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." Psalm 126:5. Her eyes stung, but she did not look away. She let the tears come, not as chains of sorrow, but as waters of release. She had sown in grief, in humiliation and loneliness. Now, standing on this porch, she felt the first stirrings of a harvest, fragile but certain. The wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Birds stirred in the trees, their calls threading through the morning air. The world was not perfect, nor would it ever be. Scars remained, as visible as the cracks in the mended teacup on the windowsill. But scars were not ruin. They were proof of survival, of endurance, of grace. Clara lifted her chin toward the ridge, where shadows once threatened. Today it was only earth and sky, light spilling across the horizon. She let out a breath, steady and sure. Beside her, Elias stood as he always had, silent, solid, present. A man shaped by hardship, yet softened by the quiet strength of choosing what was right.
Together, they watched the sun climb higher, two lives intertwined, not by law or claim, but by choice. A home, once lonely, had become theirs. And in the stillness of that morning, they knew. Whatever storms might come again, they would stand, not alone, but together. Step into a world where love rises from the dust of forgotten trails and healing grows like wildflowers after the storm. Western Love Stories is more than tales of cowboys and wide horizons. It's about hearts, scarred yet still beating. About women and men who find courage in the quiet and redemption in the steadfastness of another soul. These stories carry the weight of silence, the ache of loss, and the warmth of hope, much like a lantern glowing against the prairie night. Each chapter is a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, grace endures, and love takes root where you least expect it. If you've ever longed for stories that echo with nostalgia, stir compassion, and leave you with a flame of hope, this series was made for you. Subscribe now. Your journey into the timeless West begins here.